Games Workshop's fold-out boards are tiny, flat, and boring. But not for long. Today I'm transforming them into a huge textured and modular masterpiece with 6 interconnecting pieces. Each board will not only elevate your Killteam skirmishes, but also combine into a massive battlefield for Warhammer 40K Onslaught. This is the biggest board project I have ever tackled, and it's pushing my creativity to the absolute limits. So stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll witness the ultimate Warhammer board come to life. So what's my issue with fold-out boards? Well, they're just so flat and shiny and make tabletop games feel too much like board games. For a truly immersive experience, we need these games to be 3D games. Okay, so first things first, I need a Killteam board for some inspiration. Thankfully, I've got quite a few. Do I have a problem? Maybe. I decided to go with the new Killteam Hivestorm board because, well, it's shiny and new. And kinda awesome actually, with its grim dark colour palette, and the theme should translate well into 3D texture. Okay, now let's get crafting. I bought the needed materials from my local hardware store and had 6 MDF sheets cut to the Killteam board dimensions. These pieces of MDF have come straight from the hardware store, pre-cut to size, and they're already showing signs of warping. So I'll be using some 30 by 30 mil pine timber for the frame. Building 6 boards means a lot of timber to cut. This was then fixed to the MDF with wood glue clamped in place to try and make sure the frame was as perfectly aligned with the base as possible. Despite all the care I took when doing this, there were still some irregularities in areas where the timber was ever so slightly off the edge of the MDF. This was a major worry. Even a couple of millimeters difference can spoil the effect of modular boards. It was beginning to dawn on me what a mammoth task making 6 boards would be. I then cut strips of MDF which I would use to line the edges of each board. Once again, I desperately tried keeping everything as uniform as possible. This thing's gonna weigh a ton. Meanwhile, I'm covered in MDF dust and I need to clean up. The great thing about kids is they can be made to clean up after your mess. Now, to pull off effective modularity, some planning is essential. So I made a small mock-up using some paper to represent the boards. I measured the areas on each side where they would connect and drew rough lines of where the craters and rubble would be. This is a great way to test if a concept will work before really committing to it. By doing this, I could see that this should work really well with my boards, and so now it's time for some more carefully considered cuts. I measured some guidelines before roughly drawing the shapes of the depressions I will cut. I figured that once I had cut one piece, I could use it as a template and just trace the remaining side pieces. I used my jigsaw to cut out the depressions, working outside this time to avoid sawdust going all over my stuff. Okay, now that I've cut the first hollows, I've realised that the fact that they're not symmetrical means that they won't line up perfectly. If I trace the outline onto another one of these side pieces, okay, so that's the outline on this side, but if I flip this over, so like 2 connecting pieces, yeah, they don't line up. That's really annoying. This means there'll be a noticeable join and they won't be as modular as I'd like. So I set about fixing my error in a rather overcomplicated way. Okay, so those bits there, that's the disparity between them. But hang on, I've got this one as well. Each side has to be the same, so it's symmetrical both ways. My brain hurts. This was certainly not helped by the fact that I'd recently lost my glasses and had to wait 2 weeks for a replacement pair. So anyway, I traced each shape and then highlighted the lowest line. So after cutting my new template piece, I figured I could speed things up by working in batches. By tracing the guide onto one strip and then clamping it together with multiple strips, I could cut a bunch at a time. Or so I thought. After multiple failed attempts, mishaps and close calls, I resignedly decided to cut each strip individually. This meant I had to trace those guidelines onto each individual piece. Alright, let's get cutting. This was definitely the safer option. With all 24 side pieces finally complete, it was time to attach them to my frames. I needed to be extremely careful in how I connected them to make sure I had perfect right angles. Okay, my first attempt turned into an unmitigated disaster, in which I almost gave up on the whole project. Don't move. No, don't move. Oh my god. A whole lot of clamps and pure determination later, I had one board reasonably well done. After work the next day with the glue fully set, it was time to check those right angles. That's not good. Oh, that's miles off as well. That one is miles off. Pretty much my worst fears realised at this point. They're angled in at the top, which means there's going to be a big gap where the pieces join. Okay, I'm pretty worried about this one. I'm not sure how I'm going to salvage it, and I've got a cunning plan for the remaining 5 boards. I'll deal with this one at the end. So the cunning plan was to cut a small piece of timber for each corner of the board. The idea was to glue them at the correct angle to the base, which would make it far easier to align the side pieces. This worked an absolute treat. Well, it's the end of the working week for me and I've finally got a new pair of glasses. So no more excuses, let's sort out this modularity. Now that those corner pieces were set in place, it was a relatively simple task of gluing the side pieces to each side. With considerable relief, I moved on to the foam. This was a simple process of cutting sheets to fit and gluing them into the frames. I layered 2 sheets on each board to match the height of the sides and provide enough depth for the craters. This thing has turned into an absolute monster. It's certainly not going to help my storage situation, but you know what, that's okay. I really want these boards to be super immersive, textured, as well as modular, so I can piece them together and make a battlefield truly worth fighting over. I used the Hivestorm foldout board as a guide for one of my boards and used a Sharpie to map out where the craters and rubble would be. With the remaining 5 boards, I just went with what I thought would look good, not only as individual boards, but as sections of a much larger battlefield. Shading in the areas that would be cut out helped because otherwise it was very easy to lose track of what was what. A final check gave me an idea of how well the modularity would work. Okay, now we're gonna get really messy. It's time to cut out all this negative space. Using a sharp retractable blade, I basically just hacked into the polystyrene and dug out the marked areas. I varied the depth, keeping some parts fairly shallow whilst digging right down into the bottom sheet in some areas. Polystyrene is not a great material to work with. It's messy and the bubbly texture doesn't really lend itself to carving details well. It is, however, useful for building up a base structure and is cheaper than XPS foam and more readily available here in New Zealand. It looks like Harper is really starting to perfect his weathering technique. The bigger chunks of polystyrene can be used for small hills and packing out gaps in future projects, but if anyone has any bright ideas about how to reuse the smaller bits, please let me know in the comments. Using a blowtorch is a fun way to deal with all those little flaky bits of polystyrene and round off the scrappy edges. It also creates a hardened skin which will make the surface of the polystyrene firm and easier to apply glue. Doing this in a well-ventilated area is essential for clearing out those horrible fumes. Now to create an urban, war-ravaged concrete surface, I need to cover the polystyrene with XPS tiles. Yes, they're definitely tiles this time, not bricks. So this meant cutting carefully measured and uniform blocks of my dwindling supply of XPS. These were then sliced into the 5mm thick tiles I needed. So far I have sliced up 35 pieces of this XPS for my concrete blocks. I still have this big pile here and this pile of the blue foam. So according to my calculations, I need 30 of these to cover each board. So there's 6 boards, so that means 180 in total. And all I've done is 35. So I resumed slicing with mad determination on my Proxxon hot wire cutter, and my pile of XPS tiles continued to grow ever upwards. Somewhere along the lines, I started cheating and cut some that were double the length as a bit of a shortcut. The added benefit was that it would add some variation to the tile arrangement of my boards. Now that I had a thoroughly ridiculous collection of foam tiles, it was time to start sticking them into place. I used PVA glue to fix them to each board and cut them where necessary to fit the shape of the craters. In hindsight, it would have been far easier to do all the crater cutting after this step. Okay, well here I am at the end of the weekend and I really thought that I'd be onto the painting side of this project. But as it is, I haven't even started texturing these things. In fact, this is the 6th and final board onto which I need to glue the abominable puzzle that is these XPS sheets. Once I've done that, I can let it set overnight and finally start texturing these boards after work tomorrow. Oh, there we go with another shot of gluing foam. The colour of the foam has no significance, by the way. These were just the sheets I had left over from other projects. I will definitely need to be ordering some more fairly soon, so if you happen to know any suppliers here in New Zealand, please let me know in the comments. Now that the XPS sheets were covering all 6 boards, it was time to apply texture. The idea here was to create the look of cracked and blasted slabs of concrete. And to do this, I used a multitude of techniques, mostly with a sharp retractable blade. Triangle slices. These are a quick way of covering a lot of area and give almost a caricature of broken stone or concrete. It's not very realistic, but can look effective at this scale. The slice and flick. As the name suggests, I slice down into the foam and then flick the blade sideways, which results in a nice chipped look. Crosshatch cuts. Quickly slicing the foam in a rough crosshatch pattern like this gives some areas a bit more rough detailing. Chipping. Adding chips into the foam by flicking small chunks out with the blade adds some variation to the otherwise flat surfaces. Impact craters. I added some impact craters by pressing down hard into the foam with an aluminium foil ball and then making quick cuts in an outwards direction. Adding chips then really sells the look of an impact or blast mark in the foam. Aluminium ball texturing. Using a scrunched up ball of aluminium to press into the foam sparingly helps sell the idea that this is rock or concrete. Rockcrete? By combining these techniques in a haphazard and non-uniform way, you can achieve a convincing and effective battle-damaged look. Oh wait, there's one more technique I wanted to show you. Screwdriver shanking. Time for some dakka damage. Using a couple of Phillips head screwdrivers, I quickly and lightly stab them into the foam to create the impression of bullet holes. Don't ask me why someone's been shooting straight down at the ground. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war and inept warriors who shoot at their own feet, apparently. And yes, it is essential to make dakka sounds as you do this. Adding texture to foam like this can be great fun when you're working on one Killteam board. Doing 6 is a lot, but I chipped away at it over several evenings, causing little foam flakes to float down upon my feet like the ashes of quality time with my family. No time for that, I need to add rubble to those craters. So for the rubble, I'm going to need some materials with a wide range of textures. Fine sand, coarse sand, gravel and tile grout, along with some broken bits of those XPS sheets. Spreading plaster in a thick slab like this before smashing it into bits with a hammer adds another excellent material for rubble. But I also need some details to really embed this board in the Warhammer 40K universe. So firstly, I cut up some bits of Plasticard which will represent twisted and broken pipes and metal struts. And then I needed to try and recreate these barrels, boxes and hatches. I opened up Blender and had a go at digital sculpting, then remembered I have no idea what I'm doing. So I reached out to the amazing Ty at Darkfire Designs, who also happens to be one of my patrons, and he generously whipped up some gorgeous 3D sculpts for me to print. I quickly realised I would need a lot of these details, so jammed the print bed with as many as possible and printed a couple of batches. The ability to add awesome little details like this is definitely a major advantage of having a resin printer. Okay, now armed with a whole lot of materials for the rubble, I set about filling those craters. After a frustratingly slow and ineffective process of filling one very small area, I had a minor existential crisis of crippling self-doubt. Issue is, I think originally I dug too far down and now I've got these massive craters and I'm just struggling to fill them. And I really hope that I would have been a lot further along the process. Sometimes the pressure of trying to get videos out isn't conducive to a creative mindset. Stop moping at him, get into it. To break out of the rut, I decided to hot glue in place the resin details, such as the barrels and hatches, and then I would cover all of the craters with tile grout, just to establish a base texture and hide all that gross polystyrene, and to give me an important sense of progress. I used PVA glue mixed with brown and black paint, just so that if I missed any patches with the tile grout, then at least it wouldn't be so obvious. The tile grout was then sprinkled all over the glue. This was a very messy process because I had to grout right up to the edges where each board would line up together, and I had to tilt the boards to get at the areas where the XPS tiles meet the polystyrene. A word of caution here, tile grout is toxic, so be sure to wear a mask and gloves. The grout was then activated by first spraying with isopropyl alcohol, followed by a spray of matte sealant. Once dry, the grout becomes rock hard. This provided a really solid base for me to then glue my mix of rubble. I generally try to lay down the chunky bits first and then sprinkle coarse and fine sand over the top before adding some tile grout to tie it all in texturally and provide extra adhesion. This was then all absolutely drenched in matte sealant. I applied this process in batches until all 6 boards had good rubble coverage. Have I mentioned the fact that doing 6 boards has been a mission? Well, it has. I had to replenish my rubble supplies as I ran out on board 4, and I probably went through several litres of matte sealant on this whole project, which is why I make it myself for cheap. Check in the description for the video recipe. Alright, I've finished gluing down all the rubble, and now I'm finally ready to start painting this massive board. First it needed to be primed, so I mixed together a whole lot of Modpodge along with black house paint thinned with water. By thinning it so much, it should run into all those cracks and crevices, and the Modpodge will seal the foam and make it safe to spray. Once again, the size of this board meant a lot of priming, so it was time for some of that much needed quality time, in the form of child labour. My daughter actually loves crafting with me, which is such a privilege and undeniably helpful when you have 6 boards to paint. With a fair amount of trepidation, I used a rattle can to give the whole board a patchy grey base coat. Thankfully, the previous step had sealed everything sufficiently and none of the foam melted. I really like the almost teal colour of the rockcrete and how it contrasts with the spots of reddish brown. So I mixed together some Vallejo Israeli sand with Vallejo French blue, and then struggled to use my airbrush, which was misbehaving. So in frustration, I used a sponge to dab the colour onto all the concrete slabs. Thankfully, the airbrush just needed a thorough clean, and then it worked just fine. So I built up the colours evenly over all 6 boards to create nice subtle variations of tone across the concrete and rubble. As with every other step of this project, this took time because of the board's sheer size. I'm just so thankful I have an airbrush for this, because using a standard brush would have broken me. I also wanted to add some Imperial Aquila icons, so I had a stencil cut out at work. I picked out some random spots on the boards to add the Aquila and thought about how I could make them look really scratched up and weathered. I saw my mate Lockie from Zorp do some salt weathering over at Weta Workshop and thought it would be an interesting technique to try. The idea is to dampen the surface before throwing salt at it. The salt sticks to the water and creates a mask over which you can paint. Once the paint is dry, you simply brush away the salt and it leaves a mottled and worn look. When using the stencil on battle damaged sections, I used tin foil to pack out and mask the exposed areas of rubble and the cracks so the paint would only mark the concrete. It can be a lot of fun creatively trying out different techniques like this, and it worked really well for the most part. The New Zealand humidity started to affect it though, with the salt just turning to liquid and causing rather fuzzy stencils. Then I moved on to picking out some of those details. Once again, following the colour scheme of the Hivestorm board, I picked out the barrels, some with red and others with a dark bronze colour. And yes, you guessed it, there were a lot of barrels to paint. And not only that, there were the ammo crates, bits of scrap metal and hatches that also needed attention. Okay, so making a massive board like this takes a huge amount of time, not to mention all the editing that goes along with that. So if you find any value in what I'm doing here and would like to support the channel, then please consider joining my Patreon linked in the description. I would dearly appreciate it. And a huge thank you to all of those who are already supporting what I do. You truly are keeping the dream alive. Right, now back to the video. I dry brushed all over each board with a light grey to accentuate all the various textures. This also helped to tone down the red of the barrels and really embed them in the overall look. The dry brushing builds up the contrast and is where it all really starts to come to life. I was chatting away with some of my amazing patrons on Discord while doing this, and totally lost track of the time, and ended up finishing sometime after 1 in the morning. So after a much needed sleep in, I was back at it for the wash phase. To do this, I mixed some black and brown paint and added a whole lot of water. This was then just sloshed all over the boards. The wash tones back a bit of the contrast from the dry brushing and runs into all the divots and cracks. This adds some lovely depth and also dirties up the flat sections and the stencils. The boards were absolutely drowned in wash, so I placed them outside in the sun and kept a close watch for birds and cats. We're almost done, folks, but don't leave yet. Be sure to wait until the end of the video where I'll show you how I store this monster. The Hivestorm board was a great reference for my boards, and I'm well pleased with the end result. I can't wait to play some Killteam games on it, or all 6. The flat surface with sunken details allows the simple addition of scatter terrain to keep things fresh, and the fact that they can be combined in any configuration up to and including Warhammer 40K onslaught size games also makes these boards super versatile. The use of carefully measured foam tiles in this way does a great job of masking the joins and really helps pull off seamless modularity. I hope this project inspires you to create your own immersive battlefields, and please do let me know what you think in the comments.
So how do I store this beast?
The fact that this board is modular means it can break down to 6 pieces, which is far easier to store than a huge fixed board. The plan is to stack the boards on top of one another, trusting in the strength of the foam. I added felt dots to reduce the risk of damage. Then it was time to pack them away, probably breaking multiple health and safety rules in the process. As the stack grew higher, I started feeling some anxiety. As far as height goes, I'm on the Hobbit end of the spectrum, and this was starting to get awkward.
Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out these videos if you'd like to see more of my crazy projects. Until next time, good hobbying everyone.